I think the last session is not at all the list session. Rather, it's a very high voltage. We have a very high voltage panel with very distinguished and celebrity speakers, which include our dear friend, Dr. Paula Banerjee, who teaches at University of Calcutta, who has written a number of books and issues like on the issues like forced migration, borderlands, and justice, foregrounding the gender aspect. Also, she heads two of very well-known organizations. One is ours, that is MCRG. She is the president of Calcutta Research Group, and also she heads ISFM, International Association for Study of Forced Migration. Then we have with us Professor Ingo Smith, who is an economist and who teaches at University of Athabasca, Canada, who has also written extensively on the issues of labor. He is also a well-known Luxembourgian, if I may say. And then we have Emmanuel Ness, who needs no introduction, I think. He is a professor of political science at City University of New York. He is a prolific writer and editor of many books, and also he is a researcher on the issues of labor and migration. But above all, he is a very well-known labor activist and who champions the idea of workers' autonomy. So we have three distinguished writers, authors, and activists here. And then we have also with us our friend Dr. Arup Kumar Sen, who teaches at Sri Rampur College. And Arup, who like me, who live here in Kolkata, everyone knows that he poses always critical questions at every conference that he attends. So today he will be the first among the equals, that is, he will pose questions as discussion after the speeches are over. So I request Professor Emmanuel Ness to start, and he is going to speak on
I could talk about
the new industrial proletariat, imperialism, mobility, and class struggle.
I feel compelled, thank you very much for inviting me. Also, since this is a conference on critical studies and the focus is on postcolonial studies and accumulation, I felt it was necessary to begin by perhaps providing a very quick critique of the question of primitive accumulation, which is drawn from the work of Tom Brass, who was the former editor of the Journal of Peasant Studies and did extensive work in Peru as well as India. And I feel that his contribution is significant because he does not believe in primitive accumulation as such. He believes that bonded labor, unfree labor, other forms of highly exploitative labor in which workers are owned as opposed to part of a commodity relationship are in fact integral to the modern capitalist economy and not some throwback to a previous economic formation. As such, he both critiques the work of the classical economists who believe in perfect markets and individual choice, but he also provides a object lesson to Marxists who also feel that a mature capitalism is essential for the evolution or unfolding of class struggle and revolutionary politics. In this sense, he believes that forms of unfree labor, exploitation, bonded labor that are growing and expanding are a systematic form of exploitation that a rational capitalist would engage in to advance the profitability. I believe that this is a very important intervention. Certainly it's not one that is universally accepted, but one that I would highly recommend looking at. I'm going to read my parts of my presentation. I call this presentation The New Industrial Proletariat in the Global South, primarily because of the fact that we now see a significant shift in the nature of the working class on a global basis, from the global north to the global south. In this case, I'm looking primarily at production workers. Obviously, there are other kinds of workers in the service sector, and also what I refer to as effective laborers, women and so forth, who have constantly worked both in the north as well as in the south. But just to give you a bit of data on this, from 1980 to 2011, the share of the industrial employment in the world has expanded dramatically. And in the global south, that expansion has increased from 50% to 80% of the world's 3.25 billion workers in the formal sector of the economies. This is primarily because finance capital has avoided traditional unions and also higher wages in the north, and directs investments to non-union or employer-dominated enterprises. Workers, however, in my formulation, are forming new rank-and-file worker organizations to defend their collective interests, even as compliant states repress labor and repress labor demands, blocking the establishment of worker institutions. Sorry, this is very small print. This global shift is established through blocking the establishment of institutions, and primarily is found in the production industries of the South, and is pursued as a consequence of the remoteness of working people to established unions. As states in the South have competed for capital, they also succeeded in removing the traditional unions that formed and consolidated power in the post-war era, something that's well known to everyone here, particularly with respect to the colonial and post-colonial liberation struggles. Mobilization of workers in the South is challenging both national and international capitalists today, but also the institutional regime responsible for co-opting unions into a system that protected a small proportion of the urban working class, which is all too familiar with you here today in India, but also in the global north. We are seeing increasingly workers' assemblies forming through independent unions and workers' organizations in the South, demanding that informal and contract workers be given equal rights and permanent workers employed as permanent workers employed in the same factory. These demands are reminiscent of those made by the mass industrial organizations advanced by rank-and-file workers who formed syndicalist unions a century ago, most notably the industrial workers of the world. The 20th century has opened up a new era of global production that has transformed the shape, magnitude, and geopolitical location of the industrial working class from the imperial north to the colonized world of the south. The proportion of the shift and repositioning of foreign direct investment to the south for industrial production has dramatically enlarged a class of especially oppressed and exploited industrial workers for the first time in history. The failure of organized labor movements that formed in the image of American and European unions in the 30s to the 50s, 1930s to 1950s, to represent workers' interests dependably in the present era of neoliberal capitalism, reflects the capitalist state's capacity to undermine class compromises, or what I would prefer to call a ceasefire or a truce, that led to the toleration of unions here in the 1970s and beyond. Okay, just shifting a bit around poverty. The focus of media and academic research is on poverty in the North in response to growing recognition of inequality and poverty popularized by the Occupy movements in 2011. Poverty and inequality is indeed endemic to the North, above all in states that have eviscerated social welfare protection that emerged in the mid-20th century in Europe and North America. Growing disparity and rising poverty intensified in the wake of the economic shocks of 2008 to the present through government policies that allowed industrial producers to declare bankruptcy in order to restructure wages, and banks foreclosed on the homes of the working poor. However, one area that seems to be missing is in many of the debates, particularly in the North and amongst established scholars, is any recognition of the way in which surplus is extracted in the South. And for this, because I know the time is very short, I have 15 minutes, I wanted to move to a specific quote from investment bankers. But before doing so, I'd like to put forward the idea that we really need to understand globalization of the capital-labor relation as opposed to just globalization writ large. By saying this, I'm referring to a form of globalization in which the direct ultimate managers are financial capitalists in the North. Just to give you some background on this, this shift from the North to the South. In 1980, half of the world's industrial workers lived in Europe, Japan, and North America. In other words, the imperialist nations. Since then, in just 3 decades, their numbers have declined in absolute terms to around 1/4, while the export-led expansion in the industrial workforce in the low-wage countries has grown rapidly and now comprises 80% of the world's industrial workers, which I noted a moment ago. The scale and speed of this global shift, and even more so, the form it has taken, has strong evidence of the significance of the outsourcing phenomenon. The new industrial proletariat of the early 21st century has been created through the transfer of production to the South, which preserves the domination which has been created through the transfer, which preserves the domination of the capitalist class and extends the geopolitical power of ownership of and control over the system whereby surplus value is expropriated from workers in the imperial world. I think it's apropos to cite the work of Gérard Duminel and Dominique Lévy, who contend that the concentration of income and wealth is generating a privileged ruling class which controls economic and political power. This dominant class attains profits and wealth through foreign trade realized primarily from the domination, control, and increasingly, as noted earlier, possession by monopoly capitalists in the North over land, natural resources, and capital in the imperial world, which has been discussed throughout this conference. Just to quote them a bit more, economically, this is a direct quote, the purpose of this domination is the extraction of a surplus through the imposition of low prices for natural resources and investment abroad, be it portfolio or foreign direct investment. That countries of the periphery want to sell their natural resources and are eager to receive foreign investment does not change the nature of the relations of domination. Just as when within a given country workers want to sell their labor power, their ultimate source of profit. This also leads to the discussion of the eminent political economist Prabhat Patnaik on the relocation of production to low-wage countries, which is facilitated by finance to realize profits from investments in a world that is clearly in the South. And let me just quote at length for a moment. The new finance capital is not necessarily tied to industry in any special sense. It moves around the world in the quest for quick speculative gains, no matter in what sphere such gains accrue. This finance is not separate from industry, since even capital employed in industry is not immune to the quest for speculative gains. But industry does not occupy any special place in the plans of finance capital. In other words, not only does capital as finance function as capital as finance, but even capital in production also functions as capital as finance. This has been a theme that is extensive throughout the political economy literature in the contemporary era. Basically, according to Patnaik, what the process of financialization involves is namely the enormous growth of capital as finance, pure and simple, and its quest for quick speculative gains. I go on to a discussion of the high level of weakness amongst traditional forms of worker organization, and in this context, my great concern for the possibilities of new forms of worker organization that are laying the groundwork for a possible future. In saying so, I'm not resorting to a negative future, but one in which we can envision a working class that would and is capable of gaining greater levels of power. I think there's a tremendous amount of literature as well, especially with respect to South Asia. People like Jan Bremen have written extensively on it, that the term precariousness is really an inaccurate construct, one of those frequently 5 minutes forms of terminology that people like to come up with in each generation, and in this case he refers to a precariat really as a semi-proletarianized workforce, people who have been drawn out of the rural areas, forced out of the rural areas without an option to return whatsoever. So what is positive to say about this, and maybe for this part I will go off my presentation. We are seeing increasingly the formation of workers' organizations that are emerging throughout the world, but particularly in very large countries. In fact, the BRICS are one of the areas where those forms of unions are being established, who do not believe in corporatism or neo-corporatism as a means of industrial relations, that thrive not on the basis of law, not on the basis of standing, not on the basis of rights, but on the basis of lack of rights. Precisely because they do not have a formal standing, they're able to strike for whatever reason, not, for instance, in the United States, where the strike is being eviscerated and narrowed to exclude virtually every worker. If you do not have a labor law, if you do not have a right to strike, you can strike for virtually any cause or reason. Therefore, we're seeing a dramatic spate of workers' movements that are emerging in places like Brazil, South Africa, India, and China, where thousands, if not tens of thousands of workers are engaged in mass activity and striking in very large numbers. More recently, in this last year, there were two major strike waves. One would be in South Africa, where 70,000 platinum mine workers went on strike against the union that had represented them, that was part of the ANC post-apartheid alliance, the National Union of Mine Workers, which at one time was a legendary union for its representation of workers. In this case, 70,000 platinum mine workers demanded wage increases that went up to 40, 50% of their wages. They bargained for less, but since 2009, their wages have gone up by about 50%. In China, likewise, in my estimation, I believe Chinese workers, even with a one-party union and a one-party state, were capable of gaining some ground, although I think that was curtailed to some degree by the fear of workers themselves of their own power, which I could get into in the question and answer point. Getting back just very briefly to the South African example, which I think is a very significant one, we are seeing increasingly a trend of unions unable to represent the workers. Consequently, what workers are doing are pushing unions to represent them. Therefore, because the workers refuse to abide by labor laws in places like South Africa, they are saying, in my last 1 minute, to unions, we don't care who you are, what you stand for, what your political agenda is. We want you to represent us, or we will push you out of power completely. I think this is also true in India increasingly, where we are finding a growth of autonomous unions in places like Gurgaon, in the very, I'd say, infamous in this context, Maruti Suzuki struggle, where already about 150 workers are languishing in jails. I don't think in China they would imprison 147 workers now for over 2 years. And that tells us something about the idea of a democratic state. In China, no. Here, yes. Maybe just the leaders for a few weeks there, but not. Anyway, I'm highly sanguine about these possibilities. I think they represent the future in China. There are NGOs that are pushing them forward, and that may be true here with certain types of unions like the NTUI, and in South Africa, NUMSA, and a number of other groups are as well. Anyway, thank you very much for the time here. I appreciate it, and I hope we have a fruitful discussion.
Thank you, Professor Ness, for your very fascinating presentation, which touched upon many important points. I request Professor Ingo Smith to present his paper.
I want to thank the organizers for putting this on. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be here. And I think the theme of the conference, accumulation and post-colonial capitalism, is sort of an invitation to speak about Rosa Luxemburg, because among the classical Marxists, she's the one who linked the accumulation of capital to the colonization of the outside world of capital. And if you actually read the book, Accumulation of Capital, which came out in 1913, so it's 101 years old, you will find it reads like one of the most timely books you could possibly ever read. If I heard a lot about the dispossession of peasants in India over the last couple of days, and it reminds me so much of what Rosa Luxemburg wrote about the dispossession of peasants in the then Ottoman Empire and in Northern Africa. But having said that, I'd also like to caution you not to go back to a classical political economist and think, well, all the answers are there, because a book that was published more than 100 years ago cannot simply be applied today. as if it was written as a script for revolutionary socialist struggles 100 years later. Obviously, it was written for the struggles of the days of Rosa Luxemburg. So what I'm suggesting is that in Rosa Luxemburg's work, and in particular the accumulation of capital, you find the tools, or we find the tools that help us to understand the situation we are in and also helps us to conceptualize. I have to throw in some marketing here, the commodification of radical conferences by advertising a book, and of course it doesn't come from an Ivy League US campus. And it's not written in the imperial language that I use here. It's written in my native language, German, and comes out from a small socialist publishing house in Germany. So if you happen to speak German or know anybody who's capable of speaking German and possibly interested, I don't carry this back to, so somebody has to help me to get rid of it. Of course, the first one is for free, the second one you pay for. Which brings me to the logic of capital, which is what we can learn from Rosa Luxemburg. I actually would argue that she has two important and relevant aspects to her work. One is economics, the other is politics. And in her economics, she talks about the logic of capital, how it unfolds. But unlike all other classical and most contemporary Marxist political economists, she not only looks at the accumulation of capital per se, but also how this is only possible through the penetration of non-capitalist social strata to keep capital accumulation going. So this is something you have to keep in mind. It's about commodification and colonization of various aspects of life. And this is her long-term perspective. She argues if there's no way for capital to penetrate non-capitalist socialist relationships, then accumulation cannot go on any longer. There will be kind of a permanent crisis of capitalism. But the point she also makes is that capital pursuing this colonization of every aspect of life runs up against limits long before this theoretical end point is reached. And this leads me to the second aspect of her work, which is politics, or what I like to call the forces of resistance. Forces of resistance, of course, this is labor movements struggling over the rate of exploitation, surplus value, struggling for higher wages, shorter hours, better working conditions, etc., etc. But it's also about people who are not yet colonized, who are not under the regime of capital, who simply say no, who refuse to be colonized. And that obviously creates pressure within capitalism and leads to tensions that explode in major crises of capitalist development. Now, Luxemburg developed these kind of arguments against the background of 19th century industrialization of the imperialist centers, going hand in hand with what I would call the political colonization of what we now know as the global south. What is important to understand, though, is not that the imperialist centers were capitalist and the colonies were non-capitalist. In both parts of the world, in the north as much as in the south, we found non-capitalist socialist relationships, and these eventually marked limits to capital accumulation, leading to the age of catastrophe, in the words of Eric Hobsbawm, from 1914 to 1945. And these limits were in the north that there were significant non-capitalist sectors, for example, in independent peasantry, small shopkeepers. They traded in money, but they did not have to accumulate, and they also tied enormous masses of people. There were unlimited supplies of labor, keeping an ceiling on the development of wages. Therefore, the dream of revisionist social democrats that workers can not only produce much but also consume lots was not possible, because there were these unlimited supplies of labor. At the same time, colonialism in the south was all about resource extraction and getting agricultural products out of the colonies. That didn't require any industrialization. All it required was the setup transportation sectors. So there was not much room for capitalist expansion, and as I said, this led to the age of catastrophe, a series of wars, revolutions, and counter-revolutions. These revolutions were social revolutions, but also anti-colonial revolutions, which then in the post-1945 period led us into an entirely different world, entirely different from what Rosa Luxemburg had seen before her eyes. And I call those the three worlds of statism. Statism means that in response to the challenges posed by workers' movements, anti-colonial movements, states in all parts of the world gave some protections to the popular classes. But there's a double character to these protections, at least as far as the capitalist world is concerned. The Soviet Union and its allies is a different story, and I don't have time to talk about this here. The double character of the state means that there were certain protections for the popular classes, but at the same time the state was also a kind of door opener for further capital accumulation, because the post-war period was not only one of unprecedented capital accumulation, but also one of further colonization. So if you think colonization stopped with the emergence of post-colonial states, I would argue this has not been the case. And what we see in a certain way, or what we saw in a certain way, is a reversal of the accumulation patterns of the 19th century. We saw in the rich countries in the north the emergence of welfare states, eventually allowing workers to move up a little bit in their standards of living, actually quite significantly. And that went hand in hand with what I would call, stealing an idea from Jürgen Habermas, the social philosopher, the colonization of life worlds. But it was not just a matter of social philosophy, it was in terms of selling mass-produced consumer goods, it was actually quite real. So there's an economic core to that. At the same time, we see the first steps towards the industrialization of the South. So corporations from the rich countries found new outlets for their investments. This whole post-war prosperity period ran into limits in the North, political limits. There was an unprecedented and unexpected wave of labor militancy. And there were the new social movements, notably the environmental movement and the women's movement, and both I would consider as anti-colonial movements because they did say stop to further capital accumulation. This was true for the women's movement and their struggles about the question of domestic labor, whether it should be paid or not, and it created tensions within the then or for the then existing strategies of capital accumulation. And in the South, what we saw was a radicalization of some of the developmental states that had developed in the post-colonial era. And one could also say anti-colonialism in some countries turned anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist, which it hasn't been before. And that, of course, was a major threat after also already losing access to the Soviet Empire and communist China. There was a kind of a reason to see, well, now it's Vietnam and whoever knows whether Chile will be next or not. And therefore we had another major capitalist crisis. We are in the 1970s. We are nearing the present and the end of my presentation also. We had a political effort to reconstitute the power of capital. This is very much in the line with people like David Harvey. And at the core of that, I would say, was an effort to unmake the social blocks and the working classes that had carried the welfare state projects in the north and the developmental projects in the south by bypassing kind of the sites of resistance and opposition and the institutions that had developed, like unions and the developmental state, the welfare state. And this bypassing of opposition also represented new opportunities for capital accumulation because a new liberal infrastructure, ports, railways, new sites of production, or the move of manufacturing to the south that many talked about come to mind here. And then, of course, the rather unexpected implosion of the Soviet Union that was undeserved by the capitalists. It was just kind of a ripe fruit of a kind of socialism that was incapable of to reform itself, opened further new markets. And with this, we see the cycle of neoliberalism, bubbles, crisis, and austerity policies all over the world. This cycle goes on and on and on, and the question is coming to an end, and to the question of resistance. What is the perspective of resistance? I would argue that neoliberalism in a way hit the wall already in 2001 when the new economy bubble burst, and at the same time we saw the emergence of political movements. There was the famous or infamous Battle of Seattle. There was the World Social Forum movement. Already in '94 there was the Chiapas uprising. None of these movements was powerful, but all articulated a strong and rising tide of discontent with neoliberalism. And I think this was taken very serious by the ruling classes. Located in the old imperialist centers, and the war on terror, I would argue, was not only a war against Iraq, because Saddam Hussein was no threat. He was good for imperialists as long as he was gassing Kurds, right? And nobody had ever any hesitation to work with the guy. I think the war on terror, to a significant degree, was a preemptive war against the social movements that could have come out of the World Social Forum movement. And successfully, the war on terror put to rest, despite a very short-lived outbreak of mass demonstrations against these wars, put to rest this rising tide of social forum type of movements. However, it also shifted the accumulation strategies toward a resurgence of the military-industrial complex. Using the military is good business for the deliverers of the weaponry, but for capital as a whole, it didn't exactly pay out because there was no need to conquer new markets, to conquer access to resources. Saddam Hussein was more than willing every barrel of oil he could. The same was the case a little later for in Libya. So the access to the resources was already secured. And as a result, the cost of war was exploding, whereas the revenue derived from those wars was not as large as the capitalists probably were hoping for. And that eventually led to another major economic crisis and a resurgence of the social forum type of struggles. We saw the Occupy movement, we saw the Arab Spring, and again, very similar to what happened around the Battle of Seattle and similar types of demonstrations, not very powerful, but articulating an even larger discontent with neoliberalism. And what this does, I would argue, is that we see the onset, and also bringing in Manny's argument about the unrest on the shop floors of the global south, that we are in the early stages of the remaking of working classes on a global scale. The working classes Rosa Luxemburg talked about, and even though she was a dedicated internationalist, internationalism for her largely meant the internationalism of the various northern countries. And today we have a working class that is much more spread out globally. But also we should not forget that the majority of the world's population is still living on the land. Some of them probably could be called working classes, but a significant part of them is the peasantry. So with the making of new working classes, the question of alliances with other popular classes arises. And I do want to end on a hopeful note. I know all the movements that we see these days are by and large defeated, but if you go back to the early history of working class formation in the 19th century, you will see those guys were also defeated over and over again. But from each defeat, there were some people kind of sticking to the cause, drawing some conclusions, using the experiences they made in struggle to prepare for the next wave of organizing and struggle. And I hope very much this is what this conference will contribute to. In that sense, I thank you for your patience and look forward to continue the discussion for you, but even more so this, the struggle for a socialist future. Thank you very much.
Now I request Paula to speak on her paper, and the paper is on resistance under the sign of developmentalism. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Basu. Firstly, the title was given by Otik before the paper. So, but anyway, I'll try to stick to that title. I will not begin with an apologia because I hate apologizing, but I will begin with a statement that is, I'm not into making grand theories or meta-narratives. So unlike Rito Jyoti's paradigm, my second book was not on theories at all. My story will not have a grand narrative. But, you know, I was thinking that why am I in this panel for some times now, other than the fact that I complain being only put in a panel on gender. Whenever my name comes up, it's like, oh, Pauladi, let's put her in gender. So I always say that, you know, gender can also make grander claims, and we can be in other parts as well, and resistance is a place where we are very sort of at home. So I thank Otik for placing me in resistance, but knowing the other two authors' works, I was wondering where I fit in. But after Professor Ingo Schmidt's presentation, I think I fit in very well, because I will continue the story of colonization. I will continue the story of commodification, although the geographical space will be different. But I think we will find a lot of resonance with what has been already discussed in this panel. So having said that, my geographical space is in Northeast India. We've been talking about Northeast for a couple of, in different panels over the last 2 days. So I guess most people know where it is. It is tied to the Indian mainland through what is considered as a chicken's neck. But I will speak about a very specific part of Northeast India. And this part, a lot of people here have not heard me talk about that, because I'm generally sort of identified with speaking on Assam or Nagaland or something of that sort. But today I'm going to talk about Tripura, because Tripura is again a very, very, very interesting case. It's one of the cases where our good friend Shubir Bhomik, I wish he was here today, then we could have had a debate, because Shubir is oft found saying that it is the best governed state in Northeast India, which might be so. I mean, I'm not contradicting that, but even with the best governed states of the world, there are a lot of problems. And Tripura is no exception there. I personally am very fond of the Chief Minister Manik Sarkar, but that doesn't take us away from the problems which are very visible in the context of Tripura. Again, Shubir is oft saying, and he's written extensively about that one of the biggest advantage of Tripura is it has taken care of the insurgency movement. But insurgency movements have long histories. So even though Sri Lanka might think it has taken care of the movement, one doesn't really believe in that. It has, you know, the ability to keep appearing and reappearing in different forms and avatars, and leaving, you know, really, really strong imprints. And the one thing that I'm definitely going to do is, you know, although I removed myself from the panel on gender, gender never leaves me. So I'm going to talk about a gendered narrative of the politics that is appearing in the context of Tripura, which is, again, a very neoliberal state, and although well-governed, it's supposed to be within the parameters of good governance of the World Bank and other monetary organizations or loan-giving donor organizations. So recently, in fact, Tripura, again in 2013, the state of Tripura, the same left-front government was, sort of massacred all over India, but it retained its stronghold in Tripura. So that itself was cause for a lot of investigation as to what is happening in Tripura. I mean, is it that the left front is doing all the right things there, or is it something else? And hence, this is where I sort of got the inspiration to start working. The other thing I must say is working on Tripura is no exception to Calcutta Research Group, the group that I identify myself with. And we came out with a very, very interesting document, which was not very widely read, called Abhiram Raktopat, which is perennial bloodshed on Tripura. And it was based on the 1980s conflict that happened in Tripura, and which sort of had resonance in the 90s. And it sort of continued. So I have to sort of show my gratefulness to the people who authored that report, because my work is sort of derivative of that. So one of the slogans that the new Chief Minister of Tripura has come up with is work during day and sleep at night. And this is considered as the reason for this the success of Tripura within the context of Northeast India. So Tripura government says that we've been able to give the people jobs, we've been able to give the people peace, so they can peacefully sleep at night and have jobs to go to during the day. But where is politics in all of this? There is this huge gap, and nobody seems to have a problem with that gap. And the other, question that, and the other, symbol of success of Tripura was marked by its women's politicization, represented by the enumeration of huge number of women in the voter list. And so the voter list, the male voter list was something like 11 lakhs 90 something thousand, and the female voter list was something like 11 lakhs 50 something thousand. But there was again a figure of 9 lakhs missing. These are largely the indigenous people of Tripura. The other interesting fact is that when one looks at the male voters and the female voters actually outnumber, even though the registration is less, but actually about people giving votes, the female voters outnumber, because almost 95% of the female voters vote and less than 90% of the male voters vote in any given election, particularly in the last couple of elections in Tripura. So this female participation in the formal party political process is considered as this great experimentation and an achievement of the government of Tripura. And Tripura also has the distinction of producing the largest number of MLAs. So they have female MLAs. So among their 60 representatives, 8 of them are women, which is, rather 5 of them are women, which is like roughly a little over 8%. But the interesting thing is violence against women is rampant in Tripura. So a state which is prone to reflect on its good governance, when one suddenly confronts its, the percentages that are given in National Crime Bureau, one is astounded by that. And the thing is, it's not as if the people in administration are unaware of that, but they face the fact that, yes, violence against women has not gone down in Tripura. In fact, it has increased tremendously. So having said that, I'll go a little bit to the history of Tripura and try to see why this difference in picture. I wouldn't say anomaly. I think it flows from the history very, very well as to why there is this problem. So if one looks at the history of Tripura, Tripura can be divided into, 3 main periods. The first period could be under, this is independent Tripura. I'm not talking about the, the monarchical Tripura. this Tripura, the first group of people to govern Tripura in terms of party politics was Congress. And this was, I'm being simplistic here, but because of time purposes, I think these generalizations are important, because when the Congress party came, it sort of allied itself with the Bengali settlers. And that was the high point of the coming in of the Bengali settlers. And just before the Congress went away from power, a lot of the tribal land was drafted for Bengali settlers and made legal. After that, the left parties came in. There was a rough sort of an alliance with some of the tribal population represented by Dasharat Dev Burma and all these people. But that alliance was also sort of uneasy. So one thought that, Dasharat Dev Burma and the Bengali leaders were best of friends. But, friendship has its limitations as well. And then suddenly Tripura erupted into a number of, killings represented by, well, the Golarai Bari case, the Mandai case, the Raya Bari case, one after the other, where, well, Mandai was particularly shocking for the people, because by that time there was a demographic shift in Tripura where the indigenous people had, come to became the minorities, whereas the Bengali settlers became the majorities in terms of demography in Tripura. And yet this case was against 300 Bengalis, largely laborers and peasants, were butchered in this case, and within a very short phase. So whenever one talks of the Nelly massacre in Assam, one also talks about the Mandai massacre. But the interesting thing about what one doesn't realize among the Bengali settlers, who were massacred exactly, they were not caste Hindus. They were largely Bengali Muslim settlers. So one has to look at, these demographic groups, which is very important in the context of Tripura. So, and the important thing is, there are a number of wonderful reports of these cases, and these cases are also remarkable because, or maybe non-remarkable, because of its enumeration of the number of women who were attacked by this violence. Women were killed, women were slaughtered, particularly women who were married to tribal men. The Bengali women who were married to tribal men. In fact, there are evidences where women who were married to tribal men were told 2 months before to leave their husbands. So this was sort of a very pre-planned sort of an attack. It just didn't appear out of nowhere or in the heat of the moment or anything like that. So again, this is an important phenomena. And I think what is very important in the context of Tripura is how this whole thing was contained, how this violence was contained. The whole, method of containing violence was two-pronged. One was development. 5 minutes, okay. One was development. And Tripura, again, is one of the first states to grab the Look East policy opportunities, And even before that, there was a push towards development. The other was brutal force. So you have, but not by the army. Tripura that way was sensitive. It was brutal force by the police. So, with the investments on the army, not reducing substantially, but at least going down, you have this huge spending on the police forces in Tripura, increasing. And you have the names of police commissioners like Vora, who are sort of iconic because of how they handled the whole insurgency movement in Tripura. What happened in the process was, in this developmental mode, the government started making alliances with the women of Tripura. And one of the biggest and the most important places where tribal women, and again, this is very interesting because unlike in other parts of Northeast India or even in India, mainland, the indigenous population, women in indigenous population have better work participation rate in Tripura than the settlers or the Bengalis. So this is a very interesting phenomena. Now, these women were involved in the rubber industry. So there's a huge growth of rubber industry in Tripura, women are more and more being incorporated within this development process. And it is the same with even Bengali women, not in the rubber industries, but if you look at the number of policies the government has for women to get into income generation, it is astounding. And as I said, the other is brutal force. But the important thing is, during the period of bloodshed and after that, there was this continuum of violence against women. And this violence against women was constantly sort of, first there was a denial, because among the first few reports, there was a report by the Women's Commission, and there were a number of other reports, very important reports, which were sort of denied and put underground. And then what happened was a constant process of alienation between the bloodshed and violence against women. And violence against women was considered as a very contained space. And the only way of dealing with violence against women was money, dole. So every time that a woman was raped, the government went in without looking for the perpetrators. What the government did was to give money to these women. And in a cash-poor state, these women also accepted, money. So ultimately, how much? 1 minute. Okay. Ultimately, what is happening in the process is that you have this society where there has been no sort of, decolonization process. There has been no handling of problems against women. A society where you think you've taken care of violence, but how did you take care of violence? Firstly, devaluing the whole notion of violence against women by saying that this is not integral to the development or progress of the society, and also by thinking that by giving money, you are solving the problem. And this is not just, the formal space. Also in the informal space, the Women's Commission itself, if you go through the report of the Women's Commission, it's astounding, and nobody looks at that archive, and they have report after report after report, where both for the tribal community, as well as for Bengalis, Muslims and caste Hindus, these women have got in. Whenever a woman has been molested, they have had discussions, and when the perpetrators have not been found, these women were given money because of that, and the case was forgotten, the case was shelved. So, you have, and side by side with that, there's this government which is making women alliances with women so that, they become sort of participants in this neoliberal development process that is happening in Tripura. And more there's a polarization and a gender division within the society where women are being marked as opposition. And if I could go on, I would also show other parts of Northeast India where this is happening. And that is why Northeast women are so much a threat in Northeast India today, because it is not just the administration, not just the state, but also their own communities that are attacking them, from different corners. And it fits in very well with this model of neoliberalization, commodification, and new colonization. And so, I would like to say that to have a society without really having social justice, one can never take care of the problems. And that is why to be astounded at the rate of violence against women is mere foolishness, because what you're doing is you are actually trying to make them co-compatriots in a process which itself is an unjust process, and also not looking at justice or the whole notion of social justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Now, I request my friend Arup to briefly summarize or to put questions to the speakers. Thank you.
I am planning to take Ingo and Mani's paper together because they are connected in a sense that they are concerned with reading Capital and its other labor. And I would like to start with Marx's reading of Capital in Capital. So Marx did not write the history of Capital, but his Capital is basically concerned with the reading of Capital theoretically, and for that he took England as the chief illustration in the development of his theoretical ideas. And so far as the Capital is concerned, Marx's Capital is concerned, so the primitive accumulation, there is a distinction between primitive accumulation and capitalist accumulation. So Marx posed primitive accumulation in the transition stage, but not as an organic part of capital or capital accumulation. And if we remember his famous statement that the place of the slave driver's lash is taken by the factory inspector's book of penalties. So Marx expected some kind of rule of law in mature capital accumulation, but that did not happen. So from this perspective, I would like to situate Rosa's position, and Ingo has rightly pointed out. And Rosa connected these two. Rosa connected these two in the sense that to Rosa, primitive accumulation is an organic part of capitalist accumulation, even in its maturity. And the more important thing for us that Rosa argued that capital accumulation and is connected with a capitalist expansion in non-capitalist milieus, and particularly at that time she argued that it is largely based on colonization of the South, and the mode of and while reading the mode of colonization of South, she emphasized the role of credit and political violence. So that is of a different time period, but that is important for us in reading the contemporary capital in the age of neoliberalism. And another thing that is important for us, so I would thank Ingo for raising this question, and particularly the organic link of primitive accumulation with capitalist accumulation. I think that that Rosa's theoretical arguments definitely is an original contribution to the debate. And from that, because lack of time, I would not expand on this issue, but I would like to connect this debate with Manny's Emmanuel Ness's presentation. So Manny Manny has raised an important question regarding the geopolitical shift in capitalism, in the sense that both shift in capital and as well as the relocation of labor. So if we connect it with the finance capital, the predominant role of finance capital in the age of neoliberalism, so in this age of neoliberalism, I find that both capital and labor are footloose, in the sense that finance capital is always footloose, that it travels, and Manny has correctly argued that there is a vast shift in the relocation of labor from the north to the south, because statistically speaking, from 50% of the industrial employment to 80%, it increased during the period, during a short period, it increased the share of industrial employment in the global south increased from 50% to 80%. And connected with this shift, also there is a major change in the mode of labor protest or labor organization. And many talked about the traditional unions during the stage of welfare capitalism or Keynesian welfare capitalism. And here I would say that, and he talked about how the traditional unions act as intermediaries, traditional unions act, or union functionaries, they were co-opted by the management, and some kind of hierarchy prevailed in the trade unions. So I think that this kind of hierarchy that you talked about in the context of the North, here also prevailed some kind of hierarchy, but I think that the Indian or the non-Western case, the hierarchy is slightly different, in the sense that they not only negotiated with the management, so some kind of caste question is important here, because all the important labor officials of the traditional unions come from mostly from the upper caste. So the caste factor is important in explaining this hierarchy. So I think that this point is important. But the most important thing that I would like to argue, that the Rosa raised the question of the colonization of the South, and she emphasized the role of credit as well as political violence. Neoliberal capitalism is organically connected with the concept of primitive accumulation. Definitely there is a transformation of the way of primitive accumulation. The parameters may be different, but these categories are important. I think that this question of primitive, whether one subscribes to David Harvey's position or not, how the legalities or illegalities are combined, so that is different. But how would you read it? It can be read from different angles, but the question of, no one can negate the question of violence in this rule of finance capital. And when he has rightly situated this rule of finance capital and the associate violence with imperialism. So that's also important, that how this capital accumulation is connected with imperialism. The production sites are shifted to the south, the capital is coming to the south, but it is dictated still from the north. So I think that the special question is important. So I would like to finish with taking this southern question. So Rosa's position of the colonization of the south and Manny's position of shifting of both capital as well as labor in the southern zone. So I think that this is important because the spatial dimension of capitalism is very important, and I would like to refer to the Gramscian question. The Gramsci posed the southern question in a different sense, but if we take it at least metaphorically, I think that this spatial question is very much important in understanding of capitalism. And I think that if someone is asked to state one's position, that the kind of independent unions or autonomous unions that you have talked about, which represent different ideological positions, but I think that the Gramsci's factory council concept is very important, because Gramsci categorically argued that trade unions and political parties are born on the terrain of the bourgeois democracy. So they have their limits. And factory council goes beyond these limits and also crosses the legal limits. So that is important. So how these three categories, the political parties, the trade union, we cannot give farewell to the traditional unions or political parties. But I think that we should try to subvert them from within by raising the issue of factory council, which are taking different shapes in the form of worker assemblies or other forms that you have talked about. Now, I would not speak more on this, but I would like to make a few comments on Paula's paper. In my reading, Paula's paper is basically concerned with an ethnographic reading of politics in Tripura from a gender perspective. And she has talked about a lot of, there is in a historical perspective, she has posed initially, in the early phase, there is massive tribal displacement of tribal population, and particularly by the Bengali settlers, but that led to tremendous violence on both sides, and what happened that Paula's data suggests that the fallout of that recent phenomenon, that from 1995 to 2000, that tribal insurgency led to massive displacement of Bengalis also. But what is most important to me in Paula's paper, that Paula has argued that apparently the women's there is if one read on the surface, so there are many ways by which we can argue that that women were empowered during the left rule. But if one goes deeper, so that is very problematic. Paula argued that Tripura is the first state in northeast India to have a women's commission. So this is one thing, and left front government also took various measures for the empowerment of women, particularly tribal women, and there are a lot of schemes like Women and Tribal Development Plan financed by the World Bank, where the educational and aspects of the tribal women are taken care of. But what is most important to me in Paula's paper is the different counter-insurgency operations which took place in Tripura under the leadership of the left, and women were also incorporated in these counter-insurgency operations. The Paula talked about that the introduction of plantation crops like rubber and creation of class of wealthy tribals, and also creating a strict separation between the wealthy tribals and the subaltern tribals, and also strengthening of the police force by the left leaders in Tripura. And but most important thing that she has observed, that women's role in peacekeeping and counter-insurgency. And she has argued through her interviews that women of the Shanti Sena, they held secret understanding with security forces, and also even visited villages in night where insurgency had hit at its worst. So I think that Paula's paper is very important in understanding not only the women's question in Tripura, but also the how the left ruled, including its counter-insurgency measures. Thank you.
Thank you, Arup. Now the House is open for discussion. You may ask question or make general comments, but be brief in your questions when you are asking questions and making comments.
My name is Mithilesh, and I'm a PhD candidate at University of Western Sydney, Australia. My question/observation is to Professor Emmanuel Ness. I would like you to drill on the question of on the union and the shape that it is taking. My sense is that we become a bit emotional when it comes to unions, considering the situation right now. But I think we have to be dialectical rather than emotional. When we are talking about unions, it's not only capital which is coming from the south. Capital. It's not only capital which is coming from the north. There's unions who are also coming from the north. And there are several, at least in past at least 5 to 10 years, that established unions there, especially in the US, they are coming here trying to unionize on several issues, automobile sector, hotel sector in Bombay, so on and so forth. Now, one has to be a little critical. I would avoid the word suspicious, but one has to be a little critical of these kind of developments, because the initial signs are that the kind of bargaining that is being made, the kind of demands which are being put through these unions who have organized or trying to organize, they are substantially different from what it used to be. That's one. Say, for example, we never heard of unions trying or worker struggle trying, the demand for worker struggle as being a shareholder in the factory, which happened in the recent struggle last year in Bajaj in Pune. That was one of the main things. So I guess, and the search for workers' autonomy has to take into account this kind of intervention which is happening now. I'm still not very clear, because as Lenin said that, union is the school of working class, but the problem of the school is that some really bad lessons can be learned from schools. So.
Hi, I'm Jishnu. I teach history at Serampore College. I have a very simple question to Pauladi. Pauladi, what happened to the resistance?
I'm Ranavi Shamandan. I work at CRG. This is not to any of the panelists, but since the chair has, asked me to speak out, I liked the concluding remarks of Arup, and therefore I would be very happy if the presenters can reflect on that. Now, something that Arup said, which was, I think, extremely important, even though he qualified by the word metaphor, that if it is a southern question, as Gramsci had put it in the Italian context, in other words, if it is a question of, as Professor Ingersmith has suggested, that how the social, in other words, what Marx had said, that besides the two great classes, representing capital and labor, there are others, and which Rosa actually cited also and said there was a problem in the way in which Marx was thinking. Now, if this southern question boils down to how do you insert or how do you bring into the analytics of capital and labor the others, then one can see how Gramsci was trying to face the problem. One was the question of peasantry in the south, which Gramsci was very much aware of, and Gramsci in fact wrote a lot about the two-faced character of the intellectuals of the southern part of Italy. Gramsci also reflected on the question of democracy, that how the construction of the national popular becomes crucial in understanding the South and establishing links between the North and the South. But I think the most important question that Gramsci raised and possibly left unresolved was that is it the destiny of the South to be incorporated into the world of capital through passive revolution? And unless we combine and link Gramsci's ideas on passive revolution and his lifelong concern with the Southern question, which has actually many kind of dimensions, I think the reference to Gramsci will remain incomplete. So one of the things that then one has to ask, how do we situate the question of passive revolution at the global level? If we recall, Gramsci actually mentioned that Fordism was also included in passive revolution. It was one of the techniques by which capitalism worked. If that is so, that passive revolution is a global thing, then how do we define, locate, interrogate, and further theorize the strategy of passive revolution pursued by global capital, as well as the different ways in which, recalling Gramsci's language, the national popular is being made. Because one of the things that I did not at least find, a strong resonance to, is the discussion on the question, is the national question over for the South? Gramsci was very clear that the Southern question denotes the national question. Is the national question over for us? Or does this specific route that capital takes in the southern part of the world, the global South, still recalls the national question?
Shamata Vishash, I'm a member of CRG. My question is to Pauladi, and I would like to draw your attention back to something you presented at part of the Friday lecture series when you talked about how increased participation of women in the electoral process, as women holding office posts, has also translated, or you showed a connection between that and increased violence on women. And today I saw you narrating a very similar story of development and violence on women. So my question is, so is there a, are you making a larger claim about development, which I think you are making, about how development in itself is something inherently violent, or as we understand it? Which brings me to Jishnu's question. Actually, I don't agree with it, because I thought that since the stories have at all come out, are acts of resistance.
The question, or the point that you're making is one that I agree with wholly. Since about 1997 or 1998, there has been a resurgence of Northern or Western European and North American imperialism with respect to trade unions. Obviously, it takes place after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it's also taking place in India, China, throughout the world, and in fact in places like Malawi and so forth. There's no question, I think the ones that you're talking about are these initiatives to engage in trading various types of workers against others. I have I know a lot of people who write about these kinds of unionization efforts and who praise them primarily through various initiatives that are engaged by the ILO, I believe. In Geneva, there's a number of consortia that are seeking to organize one set, for instance, of G4S workers who are security guards, if other workers who are also G4S workers don't organize. I find that to be despicable. I find it to be a form of, I would say, dominance on the part of unions and collaborationist activities on the part of unions to allow one set of workers to have the right to organize, whereas others do not. And it contributes to further divisions within specific countries. And frankly, a cynicism that the United States, which I know the most, is exporting to the rest of the world. And this cynicism is the same kind of regime that was created in the Cold War era with the effort by the CIA and the State Department to advance pro-capitalist, pro-United States unions against unions that were highly oppositionist. At that time, it was considered that those unions were supporters of the Soviet Union, the World Federation of Trade Unions, and so forth. But what I think is that, and I think it's a very good point you're making, is that the recent initiatives to forge trade unions on an international basis in the image of the American or European model, but primarily the American model, demonstrates the degree to which this is not necessarily a battle over ideology, but a battle over class struggle itself, a way to make class struggle inert completely by establishing unions that are, in my view, fake unions, which exist widely. I mean, I can go on, but I agree with you completely if that's what you're talking about. You may be, I mean, I could expand on it as well, but I have written myself on U.S. trade union imperialism, where trade unions are used as an instrument to advance American foreign policy. And it continues to this day in places like India, China, and Latin America, where you have the infiltration of the National Endowment for Democracy, the State Department, United States AID, and on and on and on as mechanisms to advance U.S. capital interests, and that U.S.-based unions will get a pittance or something like that to advance it, or they'll get free junkets to parts of the world that, you know, they can go to the beach or something like that for their union officials. But I think that's what you're referring to, I believe, is it not? I'm one of, I'll just say this very clearly, I'm probably one of the greatest opponents of U.S. labor imperialism as you can get. And I'm much less, you know, at one time I thought, okay, why should the United States, you know, why should the United States dictate Chinese policy with respect to unions? How would, you know, the United States feel if the Chinese government came into Minnesota or Iowa and told them how to deal with various types of agricultural workers? I think that would be considered to be a huge, you know, a form of foreign invasion, whereas the United States has the free will to go wherever they want throughout the world. The kind of autonomy that I'm referring to is completely different, as well as inimical to the interests of the United States, because what it does is that it increases what is absolutely the degree to which workers are paid. One just final point with respect to that is that a lot of the wage rates are not counted with respect to GDP. Therefore, when we count U.S. GDP, it fails to take into consideration the subcontracting of labor to places like India, Bangladesh, China, Vietnam, Indonesia, and so forth and so on, where contractors are paid a specific sum. The most well-known example is the case of the iPhone that is produced by Apple, where the phone is worth about $1,000 after it's paid for, with contracts and so forth, yet not the workers, the Chinese government gets about $6 of that. I mean, that fails to take into consideration, that's obviously not considered by the corporations, and I think surplus labor is not incorporated, especially into this, in the southern economies. And once we were to take that into consideration, I think we would have a much more, if it's exposed broadly, a transformative calculus on how we can evaluate the absolute worth of labor. Anyway, one can go on that subject, but I would agree, if that's what you're speaking to, I agree with you wholly.
I want to start with Ranabir's question about about the question of the passive revolution and neoliberalism. I think what is so interesting about it, and what we on the left could or should learn from that, is that neoliberalism is kind of a political project which combines one master narrative, the market, and also allows for, in market business type of language, product differentiation. So that different kinds of people can relate to it, but everybody, no matter in which position he or she finds themselves in, has to be subjected to market logic, and people internalize that. So here we have something that some people on the left were advocating for in the past, unity and diversity. And I think the point we can learn from that is, because the irony is that at the same time that market logic and, let's say, primitive economics became the most powerful ideology ever in world history, the left went totally in retreat, and to some degree it had every reason to do so, because if you suffer major defeats, and all left projects that I'm aware of either suffered a defeat or never made it to power. Both are kinds of defeats. So you have to have a good reason to be self-critical when you are defeated, but that does not mean to say, well, I don't understand the world at all, so I stop looking at the world, I just look at my own little world, and then you have millions of worlds. I think we have to be much more assertive and say, if our world is not for sale, like the World Social Forum people did say, then of course that also requires us to understand that world and come up with our alternative socialist version of unity and diversity. Because I do think in the past, when the left was powerful, it was always when it had could offer simple narratives, whether that was kind of the European labor movement with the 8-hour day, or the Bolsheviks with socialism as electrification and council, the power of the council, Soviets. Well, we might say that's not exactly what we need today, that's true, but I'm just saying we have to be able to come up with big ideas and also be able to differentiate them in such a way that people who find themselves in different positions, because there is no homogeneous working class that capitalism produces for us and we just tell them then please make a revolution. It's terribly fragmented, has always been fragmented, and it's a political project to build working classes and deal with the others, which is possibly the greatest challenge, because that has been a major failure leading to totalitarian regimes, as Hannah Arendt described. And if we fail on that score again, we might see the ultimate other of socialism, which is barbarism, which was, of course, also an idea advocated by Rosa Luxemburg, that reminding us that the stakes are high. It's not the case that well, either we do something or we don't. If we don't, then we will get barbarism for sure. But of course, we keep on struggling for socialism as the good outcome of our efforts.
Thank you, Ingo. Now, Paula.
I'll be very short. First, thank you for the questions. Second, I'm astounded. My job is not to make your job easy at all, Jishnu, okay? I think my narrative is one of resistance. My prism is resistance. In every level I can show resistance. I could turn cultural theorist and say I am resisting the meta-narrative of resistance that is presented. But no, I won't do that. But everywhere there's resistance. The whole paper is based or looked through the prism of resistance, both in terms of women's resistance to insurgency, women's resistance to development, and sometimes a story of lack is also a story of resistance. Thank you. And you're right, development, the way it's pursued in Tripura or in most of the developing world, is a very violent process.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Paula. Technically, the session ends here, but before it ends, the conference ends, I request Professor Vanobi Shamadar to say a few last words.
I just wanted to say that the style in the previous critical studies conferences had been with regard to publication, that by and large we leave it to the authors of the papers to decide what they would like to do, though we would be very happy if they approach us and tell us that if they have specific ideas about a group of papers being published either in a special issue of a journal or a website or as book. We will sit after, after a few days with the papers, and then we may approach you, and we shall be very happy if you then respond positively, because we are quite sure that by November or December we would be deciding what do we want to do with a select group of papers. So there are various possibilities, but we do not have full idea of what can be done. The experience and the impression of this thing will take time to sink in, and then we shall decide. But meanwhile, if you have discussants, chair, participants, others who have joined, of course, if they have any idea, then if they give us the idea of how some of the papers can be, with revision, can be reached to the wider readership, we shall be very happy with that.
Thank you, sir, for your brief concluding observations. I want to thank Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung for extending their unconditional support towards organizing the conference. We look forward to more such collaborations in the future and hope to continue the relationship even beyond this conference. I want to thank all the speakers for sharing their ideas here, and I hope you are taking home a lot more of them to develop your formulations further. Thanks to all the chairs for moderating the sessions and trying to keep them within time, a very daunting task indeed. I'd especially like to thank the discussants here, because they had actually the most difficult task probably. They have provided some real food for thought and enriching, and our sessions have been enriched with their valuable insights. I thank the audience for raising crucial questions, and finally, I come to thank my second home, Calcutta Research Group. Thank you all the members of Calcutta Research Group, the governing body members, especially Professor Vanobi Shamadar and Dr. Paula Banerjee for your warm encouragement and support always. I thank our secretary, Professor Prashanto Ray, and Treasurer Dr. Shivaji Pratim Basu. I'd like to thank Shamaresh Guchayat, Rajat Kanti Shur, Ratan Chakraborty, Rajkumar Mahato, Office Secretary Mrs. Chatterjee. It is only because of you that our conferences run smoothly. And my colleagues, Devarati, Imon, Madhurilata, and the name which comes at the last only because it deserves the most special mention, Dr. Atik Ghosh, the coordinator of the fifth. Yes, he deserves it because he actually did multitasking. He organized the conference and participated in it. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.